Hey everyone, and welcome to the 1 in Chinchillian Bennett guide. So let's go ahead and just immediately get into this. So let's just start with his signature abilities with his Elemental Burst. So his Elemental Burst is the key focus of Bennett's entire gameplay, and one of the reasons why he is debatably one of the better units in the game, especially as a 4-star unit. So with his Elemental Burst, it'll deal an instance of pyro damage, and then will summon a circle. Characters who are above 70% HP will get a flat attack buff that is based on Bennett's base attack. You will also continuously heal characters that are below 70% HP. And with his Ascension 4 active, it'll actually decrease his elemental skills cooldown even further, from about 4 seconds to 2 seconds, which makes things like battering a lot easier. And while his burst is active, the active character will be imbued with pyro, which can lead to some occasional instances where you are getting hit around by enemies that deal elemental damage. It can be somewhat troublesome, but for the most part, it is not the most significant thing. His elemental burst has a 12-second duration, a 15-second cooldown, and a 60 energy cost. In terms of talent priority, honestly, you can just level up his elemental burst, especially in this context of him just being a pure support, because that is where everything in regards to what he has to offer in teams is consolidated in. But it's also fine to level up his elemental skill if you want to do so, and you can leave his normal attacks unleveled. So now let's get into key constellations. So his first main constellation, honestly, this is like the one that is probably the most significant, is his Constellation 1 actually. Because with this Constellation 1 active, it'll ignore the HP condition for the flat attack buff, meaning that characters don't have to actively be above 70% HP to get the attack buff. Now they just get it unconditionally throughout the entire duration of his elemental burst. Alongside this, he'll convert some additional base attack from himself to more flat attack. So you basically get more flat attack buff from Bennett as well, which makes his Constellation literally his most notable one, and one that players across all scales should aim to get if you do opt to play him. His C5 is his next key one because it does increase his elemental burst talent level by 3, which is pretty nice because that is where his flat attack buff is built in, and his flat attack buff does actually increase with the talent level. So getting this +3 is actually really nice, as well as the fact that it offers some more healing, and this is overall just a great general stopping point. However, you can take it even a step further and get his Constellation 6, because with C6, the active character within the field will get a 15% power damage bonus. However, the catch is that it'll infuse sword, claymore, and polearm wielding characters with pyro, and this can create some minor conflict on whether or not you should unlock it. Now, I will say, if you don't really care or don't play Bennett with like physical units or units that have overrideable infusions, so things like maybe Kaching or like Ayaka, then honestly unlocking a C6 actually has more upsides than downsides, especially when you take into account the fact that you can play some more niche teams, like for example like a Razor Burgeon team if you so desire, in some other niche scenarios where his C6 is actually pretty nice and actually enables such teams. And generally speaking, with this active, this does synergize well both with power DPS characters that appreciate the power damage bonus, as well as characters with non-overrideable infusions that can benefit from his elemental burst buff in general. At the end of the day though, it is purely up to you whether you want to unlock it or not, and it's just down to your personal preference on who you typically play on your account. So now getting into some general pros and cons. So his main pros is the fact that pretty much for any attack scaling unit, and especially for DPS units, he pretty much just benefits them with ease simply because he offers that flat attack buff. Their damage increases pretty significantly just from the fact that they have Bennett on the team. You're thinking of units like maybe like Arlecchino, for example, a more recent one. Characters like Navia, characters like Lenny, they definitely appreciate having Bennett on the team and gain a notable increase when they have him on the team. Now, despite having some minor limitation to purely attack-based units, he does still have a decent amount of variety that he can be played in because of the fact that, for the most part, he can just act as a general support for a lot of different teams. For example, like Vape, like Mel, or like Overload, etc, etc. His ability to just act purely as a general support makes him somewhat flexible in the team compositions that he can actually be played in. And like I just mentioned, he does offer healing alongside buffing, so the fact that he provides a form of defensive utility as well as the fact that he provides offensive buffs to the active character is a really nice feature to have in a support for people of all levels of the game. And the most significant part, in my opinion, is the fact that pretty much most of his power is simply just in his C1. You'll notice that a lot of recent 4-star characters have a lot of their power locked either behind like C2s or like even like C6s for the most part, especially. This is notable with a lot of more recent 4-star characters having a lot of power locked behind C6, but with Bennett, you simply just unlock his C1, and like the vast majority of where his power lies in is already unlocked at your disposal. Now onto the cons. His main con is of course the fact, circle impact. His buff is unfortunately consolidated in that small circle. If you exit that circle, then all of his buffing and his healing and pretty much everything that he has to offer just goes away. So you do have to play properly in terms of things like positioning to ensure that you are maximizing on his buff, because otherwise you're just wasting uptime. And there are some cases where this can be somewhat difficult, especially cases where enemies are either farther away from each other and you're not using a grouper to collect them and pull them in closer together. Or maybe you're in a chamber where it's a little bit more difficult to pull enemies together, and in that case it can be somewhat troublesome trying to use Bennett in those cases, although not the most difficult thing, but still can be troublesome. The next thing is that he doesn't really have synergy with things like characters that don't scale with attack, or units that do scale with attack in some way, but they don't prioritize attack for most of their builds. So for example, we can take a character like Alhaitham, for example. He's a character that scaled with both Elemental Mastery and attack, especially with the fact that that's where his direct scalings are in his elemental skill. However, he does prioritize Elemental Mastery because that is where a larger percent of his scaling comes from in his damage output. And although a character like him doesn't mind having Bennett on the team and can actually gain some benefit from Bennett on the team, he prefers having just other units that can take up the slots better than Bennett, and Bennett would rather find more use in another team. And then lastly is things like when you have characters that have attack caps. Now, honestly, I think there's only just Clorinde right now that has his attack cap. I'm unsure if they're going to continue doing this, so I'm more so just leaving this as a future reference note in case they continue to do this with future characters down the line. But with Clorinde, they made it to where basically she can't really benefit from more than like 3,000 attack. And when you have Bennett on the team, he can very easily put characters over 3,000 attack and can even reach thresholds of like 3,300, 34, 3,500, etc. I've had cases where I've reached like 3,700. That's on like my super high investment build on some characters. So for the most part, Bennett has the capability of having characters have a lot of attack in their stats. But then when you have characters like Clorinde, and if they continue to make characters like Clorinde that have attack capping, or their power is severely limited after a certain threshold, this can make it to where Bennett, although can still be beneficial, won't gain as much value from his flat attack buff, which is quite unfortunate. So now let's dive into some builds, starting with artifacts. So when it comes to support building, it's very straightforward. For the most part, the general best in slot that you want to use is 4-piece Noblesse. Very straightforward set, increases his burst damage by 20%, also gives team-wide attack, which is very nice, and overall just a perfect set really to use on him. After you get good 4-piece on him with that set, you honestly don't really need to get anything else unless you want to use some different sets that we're going to get into here. So for example, there's things like 4-piece Instructors, which is a more niche set to use on him. And this set is pretty fine to use in like reaction-based teams where say somebody else is holding 4-piece Noblesse, then in that case you can just put him on Instructors then instead, and it'll work out pretty decently. Although of course you are sacrificing some main stats because of the fact that it is a 4-star artifact set. If you're a person who is playing in the early game and you're just now getting Bennett, but you can't really farm domains, then you can just use 4-piece Exile, which is a pretty decent set as it gives some energy. And if you're playing him in something like say Farina teams and you really want to prioritize some healing bonus, it is justifiable to put him on something like 4-piece Maiden's Beloved if you really want to get that extra healing bonus, so that way when characters do get healed, they can very easily get healed to full HP. However, I personally don't think you need 4-piece Maiden's Beloved for that. I don't think you need the whole set to do that. I think you can honestly just put him on a healing bonus circlet, maybe like an HP goblet or sands or whatever, and that should be able to achieve basically the same thing for the most part. But it is an option that is there nonetheless. For main sets, you can either do energy recharge sands or HP sands. For goblet, either HP or power damage bonus. And for a circlet, you can either do crit, HP, or healing bonus depending on your preference. I would say the only time you really want to do healing bonus is if you're using him in like Farina teams as the only healer. Onto energy requirements. Now this is assuming that he does one skill for every burst cast that he does in rotations. As the only pyro unit, you definitely want to build a lot of energy recharge on him if you're only using one skill per burst. This can get as high as like 270 to even like upwards of 300% in the most dire situations. However, in things like double pyro, then his energy requirements are alleviated quite a bit, going down to about 180 to 200. And of course, this is assuming that he's using one skill per burst, which is why, in my opinion, I would prefer you to try to do 2 skills per burst if you really can, because using 2 skills reduces his energy needs quite significantly. So for example, back to the solo pyro situation, it goes from 270 to 300 down to about 220 to 250 if you can get 2 skills per burst, and in double pyro around 150 to 170 instead. So this goes to show that trying to do his skill 2 times can actually be beneficial, especially in rotations where you reach the end of rotations and you just do an extra skill to get some extra battering, can be quite useful for his energy requirements. So onto weapons. So the main thing in regards to his weapons is you really want weapons that provide the highest base attack possible to be able to maximize on his elemental burst flat attack buff, because of the fact that his flat attack buff scales with his base attack, not his total attack, his base attack. So having a weapon that provides higher base attack is going to get you the most maximum upgrade possible for this buff. So in regards to some of his best options in general, for the 5-star department, there's either Mist Splitter, Aquila, Skyward Blade, or Freedom Sworn. You can also do weapons that also provide 608 base attack like Haran, for example, or like Summit Shaper, but their passives aren't as beneficial in comparison. And overall, if you have any of these 5-star weapons, then you can just equip it onto Bennett, and the high base attack that they provide will be really beneficial. In the 4-star department, there's mainly Sapwood Blade, which has one of the higher base attacks, as it has 565 base attack, and it's a craftable weapon, which is really nice. There's of course Favonius. Now of course it doesn't have as high of a base attack, but it makes up for it by providing the Favonius particles that it generates from its passive effect, which is really good in teams where Bennett is playing in that have a lot of higher energy requirement restrictions. And then of course there is Alley Flash, although with this weapon, despite having the highest base attack among the 4 stars, it is an event limited weapon, so if you are not here to get it really early into the game, then you can just rock Sapwood instead. As for the teams that Bennett can play in, he can play in a decent amount of teams like I mentioned earlier in the pros and cons section. So he can be played in mono pyro teams, he can be played in vape teams, he can be played in melt teams. He has like a niche team with like Burgeon, for example, that he can play with like Razor, Dendo Traveler, and like Zencho. But you can also play him in pseudo Burgeon teams with something like him and Kazuha, and like Nahida with like a Hydro applicator. But on top of that, he can also act as a general support. So something like if you're using him in like a hyper carry team as a general support, things like soup teams, or even like a case like maybe Mono Geo, for example, with like Ito. He has a decent variety of teams that he can be positioned in and slotted in. And honestly, this makes him a really great unit in general. All right, and that is going to conclude this quick little Bennett guide. I hope you guys did find it useful. If you did enjoy it, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more Genshin Impact content from me. And until the next video, bye bye.